Well, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this, the latest of our European Parliamentary Research Service policy roundtables. And we're doing this, as sadly nearly all our events at the moment, exclusively online. But the great advantage of doing them online is that we can have a wider diversity of speakers from many different locations, and we're delighted today that not only so many panelists, but indeed so many participants are joining us through this digital process. The topic we're going to be discussing this afternoon is how to stress test EU policies, building a more resilient Europe for tomorrow. What's the background to this? Well, from 9/11 through to coronavirus, via the economic and financial crisis, the migration crisis, and Brexit, Europe has been buffeted by a series of major shocks throughout the 21st century to date. And these disruptive events have really tested EU policies, sometimes near to breaking point. So EU decision makers are now trying to future-proof new and existing policy so that it is robust enough to cope with major unexpected developments. And the European Parliamentary Research Service, which I have the privilege to head, has been looking at how, in practice, we can stress test EU policy. And this roundtable will examine what can be done to build stronger, more resilient policy in Europe for the future. The event will hear from the Danish Technological Institute, which has been working on the subject in detail for us, followed by interventions from speakers from the European Parliament, a prominent national parliament involved in this, the Finnish Parliament, with its Committee for the Future, and interventions from speakers also from think tanks and partner institutions who are working on this subject. The purpose is to help deepen collective thinking on how we can improve policy making in this seemingly increasingly complex and uncertain world. And the focal point of the conversation is this piece of work, which has just been published by the European Parliamentary Research Service, How to Stress Test EU Policies. It's got the same title as this seminar. And some of the people who've been working most closely on the project, authoring it in its different components, will be presenting their findings to us. The idea is not to set down a rigid template or to make some prescriptive recommendation. It's rather to open up a conversation on how the EU institutions can stress test policy more effectively. And to engage in that conversation today, we're very privileged to have with us Brando Benifei, MEP, who's the rapporteur here in the European Parliament on the regulation for a European approach to artificial intelligence. Joachim Strand, who's the chair of the Committee for the Future in the Finnish Parliament. Tine Andersen, Senior Specialist at the Danish Technological Institute. Ricardo Borges de Castro, who's Associate Director in the European Policy Centre and previously worked with the EPRS at the European Commission. Dimitri Lorenzani, who is a member of the Cabinet of Maros Sefcovic, the Vice President of the European Commission, who's responsible inter alia for interinstitutional relations and legislative programming and planning between the institutions, and Beatrice Tollange, Director in the European Committee of the Regions, and somebody who's been working for a long time actually on thinking about the future in the ESPAS process. We also have here within the European Parliamentary Research Service, Mina Fernandez, who's a policy analyst in the European Added Value Unit, Alexandra Heflik, likewise policy analyst in our European Added Value Unit, and Wolfgang Hiller, who is the Director for Impact Assessment and European Added Value in the administration. Well, you've not come to hear from me, but rather to hear about what the work that we've been doing amounts to and what contribution it could make to an improved policy process. So I'm going to hand over to Alexandra Heflik and to Mina Fernandez to introduce the topic and explain the background to the study. And then during the course of the conversation, which will be moderated by Laura Pinella, we'll hear from our other distinguished guests. So over to you two now.
Thank you very much, Anthony, for these opening remarks. My name is Alexandra Heflik. I work in European Added Value Unit here in EPRS, and together with Mina Fernandez, we are responsible for the stress testing project. In the next couple of minutes, Mina and I will tell you more about it and to give you some background before we turn to the presentation of the study. So first of all, we are really excited that we can finally share with you the study and its results, and especially that we can get your feedback today and discuss it with you. The unit we work in, the European Added Value Unit, supports the committees of the European Parliament by investigating what could be the costs and benefits of further action and cooperation at EU level. And the stress testing project fits well within our work, especially because of its potential to understand and identify gaps and barriers that exist in EU action. And findings from such investigations could lay ground for future parliamentary initiatives that European Parliament could propose. We launched the stress testing project at the very beginning of this legislature in 2019, before the pandemic took hold of Europe and the world. And in early 2020, we held an internal workshop to gather insights on stress testing policies, on stress testing, how it is applied in different policy areas, and especially in banking and in climate. And this event continues that work and builds on it. Since the first lockdown, we also realized that we are actually living through one of disruptive stress testing scenarios, and that the current situation reinforces the need for stress test EU policies. But what is stress testing actually? So stress testing EU policies is about ensuring that legislation can be better prepared for disruptive events. It is not about predicting the future. In 3 words, stress testing can make legislation more robust, resilient, and reactive. For the future, for what the future will bring, whether these will be opportunities or threats. We found that stress testing proposed or existing legislation and policy strategies could be a very practical and concrete way to integrate strategic foresight into policy making and to make policies future-proofed. Yet many questions remained unanswered. Above all, we were wondering how such an exercise can be carried out in a parliamentary context, how quickly could it be done, what kind of skills would be needed. So these are some of the questions we set out to answer in the study. And Mina now will tell you more about the key findings of this stage of stress testing project. Over to you, Mina.
Great. Thank you, Alexandra, and good afternoon, everyone. It is a pleasure to be with you today and to share some findings from the study that we've been working on this past year. The study draws to a large extent from research carried out by the Danish Technological Institute. Our work also benefited from exchanges with other institutions, in particular the Commission's Joint Research Service and the OECD, which are carrying out similar activities. We are grateful for their openness and their input, and we are also delighted to see that some of them could join us here today. We also carried out a survey of the European Network of National Parliamentary Bodies to learn more about their needs and interest in stress testing policies. We will hear later from a parliamentarian from Finland, where considerable efforts have been made to integrate foresight into lawmaking. And now let's move to the findings. Please hold on as I try to share my screen. Okay, that should be up now. Okay. The study has 4 key findings for the European Parliament. First of all, stress testing is directly relevant to legislation. It can identify weak points that could be reinforced with proposals for amendments or new legislative initiatives. Second, stress testing is not a common foresight practice. While there are many studies and reports that investigate possible disruptive events that the future could bring, we know less about what this means for how policies should be designed and reinforced. This is especially relevant for the case of the EU, where policies must also take into consideration the actions of the member states. We found few examples of stress testing outside the financial sector. Nonetheless, the research suggests that stress testing could potentially offer value in all policy areas. It can promote out-of-the-box thinking on seemingly distinct policies and policy areas that should be linked or are linked under certain conditions. And lastly, we find that policymakers should be engaged for greater impact. We take this finding to heart and consider it essential for stress testing exercises to be compatible with the day-to-day activities of MEPs, as well as the Parliament's work program. Based on the research, we developed a 5-step approach to stress test policies in the European Parliament. As shown here in the figure, we start from the bottom with the first step, which is to select the legislation for the stress testing exercise. This legislation could be a proposal for new legislation, such as the proposal for the AI Act that we will hear about more later, or existing legislation that is up for review. The second step would be to invite policymakers and relevant stakeholders to participate. The third step would be to elaborate scenarios for certain disruptive events, for example, a drought, an outbreak of organized crime, or a technological breakthrough. The fourth step would be to assess the selected legislation against the scenarios. How would the legislation perform? What would be the key articles in it that would help determine the response? Where are the gaps? Where are the weak points? The fifth and last step would be to disseminate the findings. As a result of the stress testing, the legislation can be more robust, resilient, and reactive in the face of an increasingly complex future. In conclusion, we feel that we now have a good theory for how stress testing could be done, and we feel ready to put it into practice. We look forward to assist the Parliament's legislative initiative or scrutiny role with these stress testing exercises. And now I would like to introduce Dr. Tina Andersen, who led the research that supports these findings. Dr. Tina Andersen is a senior specialist at the Danish Technological Institute. She has over 25 years of experience in preparing studies for EU institutions and agencies and is an expert on strategic foresight and methods. She is a certified Foresight Essentials practitioner by the Institute for the Future in Palo Alto, California. Tina, it has been a pleasure to work with you this past year, and we are delighted to welcome you to the European Parliament today. Please, I give you the floor.
Thank you, Mina. Thanks a lot for the kind words. It has been a pleasure working with you and your unit as well, may I say. This has by far been the most interesting study I've been involved in for years, I would start by saying, and extremely relevant as well. I will share with you the key findings of our study, and in rereading the study for this talk, I realized that it's only small bits I can share with you because there are so many findings in there and so many interesting observations. But I hope this will be interesting enough for you to actually read the study. Now, Anthony Teasdale and Mina and Alexandra has lined out the background, so I can skip that, I think, and go more directly to the findings of the study. But before I do that, I will just outline what we did in this study to arrive at an approach for stress testing policies. So, before I do so, I would like to share with you the two definitions that were at the heart of the study. Now you see it. Good. Policy stress testing, as we worked with it. It's a simulation exercise, and we developed a metaphor for it. It's like when you stress test furniture or when you crash test cars, you stress test a policy to figure out whether it's durable and not dangerous to use if you subject it to stressors. So the next slide is about those stressors that were used in this study, and they are high impact, low probability events, or HILPs, as we call them. And this is a picture of the Tonga volcano. So they are events with significant impact and potentially challenging national and European policies. We found, though, that it's not the event as such often that challenges the policies. It's the ensuing consequences of the event. So it's much like a domino game where one domino falls and then it takes the rest with it. So it's not really the HILPs themselves that are the stressors, it's more the consequences of the HILPs. I will now see if I can stop sharing again. Yeah. Now I get to how we carried out the study. It had 3 main parts, and now I will try to share again. Better this time, I think. So first we did a literature review to map where policy stress testing might be used and the experiences and the methods and approaches. Subsequently, we did 4 case studies in 4 country case studies in Finland, New Zealand, the Netherlands, and UK, because we had identified those countries as countries that used foresight in policy making. But the main part of the study was the pilot stress test. So we developed an approach, a methodology to actually stress test EU legislation. And to do that, we had first to select some stressors. We had to select some policies to test, and we had to carry out a pilot test. And I will tell you about how we went along with this. To give you an overview of the selections, the policy areas which we selected in close collaboration with the colleagues in EPRS were robotics and artificial intelligence. We selected the proposed AI Act for stress testing and the disruptive events or HILPs that we considered were a large-scale cyber attack and severe flooding all over Europe and indeed all over the world, widespread flooding. The second policy area is better information for and consultation of workers, and there we looked at 3 directives. The directive on mass redundancies, on safeguarding employees' rights in the case of transfers of undertakings, and the directive on a general framework for workers' consultation. And the HILPs that we used to stress test these directives were prolonged drought and wildfires in the Mediterranean and a global economic crisis. Finally, we looked at competition. There we considered a new pro-war US president and an outburst of the black economy. So we had policy areas, we had legislation. Now I'm going to tell you about how we went along the pilot test itself. First, we had to select the HILPs for testing. You saw the result in the previous slide of that selection, but I'll tell you how in a minute. Then we needed to develop and validate those HILPs and the consequences. So what we did were producing futures wheels, and I'll also come back to that. And finally, we had to subject the selected legislation to those consequences. The HILPs we selected by crowd rating. Of course, it's, I mean, anything can happen, as we all know. And somehow you can say it could be very random to just point to specific events. We tried to take the randomness out of this by starting with a catalog of HILPs or wildcards that were designed back in 2012 by an EU project called the I Know project. And adding to this event from later work by, for instance, by the EPRS and JRC and OECD. So we had more than 50 potential HILPs. We had to do a screening. The team did the first screening and narrowing down to 10 HILPs per policy area. And then we used crowd rating in the team, a very limited crowd, you could say. But the idea was to test the methodology. So we actually voted on the HILPs on several dimensions: the impact on the economy, the impact on society, the perceived probability of the event, and so on. So we collected those scores and selected from them with the highest scores 2 HILPs with the combined highest scores. That's how we got there. So far, so good. Now to the futures wheels. So we have a HILP. Here it's the large-scale cyber attacks against critical EU infrastructure. And then we held 3 workshops, one for each policy area. And for that, we used an interactive web-based tool called Miro, which is sort of a whiteboard where you can write and move around sticky notes. We, in the team, we decided on a set of first order consequences, and then we presented those in a workshop, and the participants that were experts in the policy area could move around the sticky notes, write new sticky notes, discuss them. It was very interactive and very interesting. And you can see we got to sort of a 4th level of consequences. The next step was to order those into something more. You can see this is much more orderly. But what we did was actually arrange the sticky notes and color code them. And the color coding is according to the steep V classification, where, for instance, the light red, the light green are social consequences, the blue-green are economic consequences, the orange are political consequences, the yellow ones have to do with values. So for each of the HILPs, we ended up with a nice looking futures wheel. And then we decided only to test first and second order consequences because of the limited time available for the exercise. So now we get to the last bit. Now I need to tell you, of course, the final step was to take these first and second order consequences and go through the legal texts very, very carefully, and considering for each sentence almost what would happen to this part of the legislation if this consequence came to be true. So that was the final, that was the proper stress test, you could say. So now to the findings. And again, as I said in the beginning, this is a large study, and we tested against 2 HILP scenarios per policy area, and there are 6 pieces of legislation that we tested. So I cannot show you all the findings, but I've tried to highlight some of the more striking findings. For the rest, you need to go to the study, I'm afraid. But I hope, as I said, that this will be interesting enough for you to do so. So, with respect to robotics and AI, I think I'll just stop sharing for a minute. Yeah, with respect to robotics and AI, it was the proposed AI Act that underwent the test. And as some of you will be aware, the purpose of the AI Act is to ensure a coordinated European approach to human ethical and safety implications of AI. And also important, it characterizes AI applications according to their risk, from low risk AI to unacceptable AI. And unacceptable AI are such applications that should be prohibited. So we were most interested in the high-risk systems that can pose a threat to individuals and their safety and security. And one of the HILPs that we tested again was, I think the most relevant one in this context, was the effects of a large-scale cyber attack to European critical infrastructure. And in this scenario, we found that high-risk AI systems could end up posing unforeseen new risks to the environment if they were tampered with by cyber criminals. So they could actually pose risks to fundamental rights or public health and safety, and thus would not fulfill one of the objectives of the AI Act. Further, if such attacks would lead to major data losses, which I think is not very far-fetched given what we've seen in the last few years, this could lead to the collapse of the system of documenting, logging, and monitoring of AI systems, which is an assumption in the proposed law that producers, users of AI systems should actually document and keep logs of the systems. So one of the gap that we identified was a requirement to store this documentation offline, actually, in a secure way. So now I will share the screen again. So assumptions about data security may not be sufficient to avoid that major cyber attack tax disrupt critical systems and infrastructure. The second policy area was the information and consultation of workers. And we tested the directives against two help scenarios: prolonged drought and wildfires in the Mediterranean and global economic crisis. And I'll only tell you about the first one. Actually, and interestingly, the test of the directives indicated that the functioning of the directives themselves was not compromised in these scenarios, in either of the two scenarios, actually. In the Mediterranean scenario, however, the majority of the agricultural and tourism enterprises in the Mediterranean that would be threatened in this scenario, where they couldn't keep up their businesses, the majority of those are small or micro enterprises, and the three directives have a lower threshold. That means that this threshold is actually defined by member states, but most member states have a threshold for the need for companies or enterprises to inform and consult their workers of around 50, give or take, some higher, some lower, not very much lower actually. So small or micro enterprises, they would not be required to consult or inform their workers if they were to go out of business or transfer their undertaking. So the directives themselves would function well, but they wouldn't cover the workforce in this case. So it's not a question of the legislation failing, it's a more question about its relevance. Well, the third policy area was competition policy, and in particular state aid provisions. And as you may recall, the default about state aid in the EU is that it's illegal with some exceptions which are specified in the legal text and aiming at providing flexibility needed in emergencies, basically. So the provisions, state aid provisions, were tested against a scenario centering on rapid growth of the black economy, and meaning that large shares of the economy would not be legal. It would taxes would not be paid. Banks would transactions would happen outside of banks. It would involve cryptocurrency, it would involve carbon credits, and it would be tightly interwoven with the cybercrime. In this scenario, the financial sector would struggle due to lacks of fund and liquidity. And if tax fraud and tax evasion would become more frequent, some or all member states may decide not to give aid or cannot give aid due to decrease in tax revenues. And it can become even worse because if organized crime infiltrates political processes and corruption becomes frequent, this could lead to state aid being given illegally or fraudulently. And in the last instance, if rule of law is failing in the member state and aid has been given fraudulently, state aid recovery would likely not take place. So this is, the weak point in the state aid framework that the black economy could take on a more important role in the national economies and the EU economy. So this was the very short version, but what were the main overall lessons that we learned through the study? Well, Mina and Alexandra have already given you some taste of this. I will give you a little more. Starting from the initial research, we found that clearly there was no model for policy stress testing that was immediately applicable to EU policies as a ready-to-use system. But on the bright side, the research also clearly showed that substantial knowledge and resources already exist in the EU system and in the member states that can support a system of stress testing, including, of course, ESPAS, JRC, the Foresight and Capabilities Unit in EPRS, and all the things going on in the member states, in Finland, in the Netherlands, and UK is not a member state anymore, but probably also elsewhere. So one of the main challenges that we found concerning stress testing is the use of hypothetical events as stressors in the stress test. And there are several reasons for this, which the time is not to go into that. But we found, however, that a good way to go about this is to start by a catalogue of events of HILPs. And there are as there are knowledge and resources, there are also sources out there for a catalogue of HILPs. And we also found that the selection of a few HILPs relevant for testing can be done in a non-biased process involving a variety of experts and stakeholders. And of course, we did that in a miniature scale, but it can be scaled up and down according to the resources and time available. In particular, we found that the crowd rating methodology is well suited. And of course, you would generally want to use a larger crowd than just 5 people, but it allows for a good selection of relevant events. Methods exist to overcome the challenge of selecting relevant and not random events to test against. So I will reiterate, overall, our results indicate that stress testing can indeed enhance policy design by identifying gaps and weak spots in existing or proposed legislation. And finally, the pilot test demonstrated the value of working with a light approach, such as the futures wheels. And we found that the futures wheels were really well suited because they are easy to explain and comprehend, which makes them well suited for the involvement of stakeholders that are not foresight experts and that are not specialists in policy, but all sorts of stakeholders. And the futures wheels clearly demonstrate and make very graphic how events in one domain have ripple effects into other domains and therefore impact policies across policy areas. Therefore, on the basis of all this, the study ends up recommending that a European approach to stress testing and future legislation should consider the use of existing foresight knowledge and scenarios, and that the scope and methods used in the stress testing is adapted to the available resources. So now I'm getting to the overall conclusion, which is the pilot stress tests managed to assess the robustness of the legislation in the 3 policy areas and identified a number of weak spots in some of the instruments. The study has demonstrated that stress testing can be very concrete, can be applied to concrete legislation, and can serve as a vehicle to introduce foresight in policy making. And even a light approach to stress testing legislation can work and give value, provided that stress testing is carried out with a clear link to the legislative process. So with this, I conclude my talk, and thank you for your attention. And I will hand the floor over to, I think, to Lauro.
Yes, Tine, thank you very much for your excellent presentation and for your collaboration with us to produce this very interesting and policy relevant research. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Lauro Cannella, head of the European Added Value Unit in the Research Services here in the European Parliament. I'm stepping in now as the event moderator as we shift gear to hear reflection on the study's finding from a series of distinguished panelists. The first panel will focus on perspective from parliamentarians, and I see also that Brando Benifei is joining us. And the second panel will focus on perspective from institutional and think tank partners. Each panel will be followed by a question and answer session. Participants, I encourage you to share your questions to the panelists in the chat function or in Q&A function. As noted by Alexandra De Mina in the previous presentation, we will be continuing the stress testing study during the second half of the legislature. The reflection and the feedback received in the event today will be very useful to us to determine the direction we will take. And now let's start with the first panel. And the first speaker is Brando Benifei. Brando Benifei has been a member of the European Parliament since 2014 and is a member of the European Parliament Committee on Industry, Research and Energy, Committee on Internal Market and Consumer Protection, and Special Committee on Artificial Intelligence in a Digital Age. In June 2021, he was designated by the European Parliament as a rapporteur on the European Commission's proposal for regulation on the European approach on artificial intelligence. Mr. Benifei, thank you for joining us, and the floor is yours.
I got some indications from you also on the general sense of this discussion, so I would like to answer on this. Looking from the perspective of what has been my work on the AI Act since until now, because we have been starting our work now, and I've been already, I can already take, we can say, some learnings from the start of this work. In my opinion, the AI Act is perhaps the regulation that best incorporates the concept of stress testing, because its horizontal nature and the fact that we are still in the early stage of its development are the biggest challenge for a legislator laying the ground for the next 10, 20 years to foster a new technological and social revolution. That is why this work is especially valuable, and I thank you, if I can say, on this work that has been done by the EU added value unit. So thanks also to Lauro himself that introduced me. Also on behalf of all my colleagues that are working on this topic, because I'm sure that this is something that will be useful to continue reflecting on. If I can say, it's clear that it's our duty as legislators to write laws that can stand the test of time and are flexible enough to accommodate future changes. If we look at the way you imagine the scenarios in the tests that we have been looking at, I can see that is how I would see also on these aspects, that it's true that we cannot foresee everything, and increasing to the amounts of legislation with too many scenarios could be counterproductive. It's true that catastrophic scenarios are rarely thought of, and the events envisaged in your study are not unrealistic, even if for some might look like that. So the choice of adopting some more flexible instruments, such as delegated acts in parallel with the regulation, can be a winning strategy that could guarantee flexibility and legal certainty at the same time. I need to stress, however, that we need to be careful that the Parliament, as we are discussing in a Parliament context, should not be sidelined in choosing to excessively flexibilize this discussion. Today, I had a discussion about these topics on the ways of updating legislation on a non-legislative report, the Artificial Intelligence in a Digital Age Special Committee report. We have had a shadows meeting today. We were discussing about this. And this is even more important when we look at what we put in a legislative file. You understood my point. I think it's important to look at these scenarios like you do in the study, but we need to be careful on how we put it down concretely then in the legislative work. But as I said, the delegated acts are a good way. Also, clearly we can work on annexes in the legislation, and these are some considerations that also are for sure applicable to the concrete work I am doing now, the work on the AI Act. Also, one point that for sure needs my consideration is the issue of at what stage of policy making stress testing is particularly beneficial. In my opinion, it's important that this is done in the preparatory phase, because as you know now, the legislative process is often built in the European level with a pre-legislative work from the European Parliament that sends indications to the Commission on what we would like to have in the draft, so that we can speed up then the negotiating work between Parliament and Council. Also, Council sends its ideas. In the case of the Parliament, is even more transparent through the own initiative report. And I can tell you one example, recent example, where I've seen this very clearly. It's the work on the Platform Workers Directive. The proposal clearly sees a direction taken through the exchange with stakeholders and from the Parliament input. So that's the moment when we need to get the stress testing input coming, because otherwise it would be too late later, in my opinion. And obviously, as you pointed out very clearly, in emergency situations, we must not relax our ambition to check the respect for fundamental rights. And I think the Parliament feels that it's its role to play this safeguard attention in the institutional work between the other institutions that participate in the legislative process. So I would say these can be my considerations, and I give the floor to the others. And thanks to EPRS, and thanks to Lauro Panella and for the unit for this very important moment of reflection.
Thank you very much, Mr. Benifei. Very interesting points, the use of more flexibility, delegate act. You have also already replied to one of my questions that I would like to raise to you is where in the legislative process, in your opinion, you see the space when to start the stress testing, and as you said, in preparatory phase, in preparatory part should be the most interesting moment when to start applying this stress testing methodology. This could be the similar question also for our next speakers that I'm now introducing is Mr. Joachim Strand. Is a member of the Finnish Parliament and chair of its Committee for the Future, which was established in 1993 and consists of 17 members of Parliament. He is also chair of Vasa City Council and chairman of the boards of Regional Council of Ostrobotnia, I hope I read it fine, Vazan Sako-Holi. Mr. Strand, it's my pleasure to welcome you to the European Parliament.
Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. In Finland, we really honor the work you do in the European Parliamentary Research Service. And as the chairman of the Committee for the Future, I'm very happy to have the possibility to offer a Finnish perspective on today's topic. In Finland, we actually have several institutions that support the overall resilience of the society. Should stress testing be implemented in the Finnish context, the capabilities of these institutions are a good starting point. First of all, there is the normal process of preparing, reviewing, implementing, and evaluating legislation. And regarding to this, the Committee for the Future has already in the past recommended phenomenon-based cross-sectoral approaches and the use of foresight knowledge in the preparation of legislative initiatives. Second, there are the organizations that prepare for and seek to prevent possible problem situations. The National Cybersecurity Center and the National Emergency Supply Agency are examples of relevant stakeholders. Third, there is the Finnish foresight ecosystem. Foresight is not only done by the ministries and the parliament, but also by government agencies, regional councils, municipalities, associations, citizens, businesses, and academia. This network is coordinated by the Government Foresight Group hosted by the Prime Minister's Office. I believe that this foresight community could and should be used much more also by the law drafting ministries. In this ecosystem, the role of the Committee for the Future is to identify rising developments early enough that these can be taken into account in Finnish policy making. The Committee for the Future has also emphasized the spreading of Future's competencies both horizontally across government as well as vertically from citizens to the EU level. Strategic foresight activities of the EU should empower the members rather than give them future visions from above. The development of the stress testing tool is a good step into this empowering bottom-up direction. We could say that the Committee for the Future comes closest to real stress testing when it performs its most important responsibility. That is the future proving of the government's Futures Report and Agenda 2030 report. And now we come to the final and maybe most important point of my short talk. The practice of future-proofing requires institutional support and political commitment to succeed. During the past 10 years, multiple foresight actors have raised red flags on many of the issues that are challenging us today. Yet this knowledge has not been sufficiently processed by the decision-making systems. For decades, there has also been talk about the future impacts on emerging technologies, but often we forget that, for instance, technology to solve the climate crisis very much already exists. We just need to implement it on a system level. Personally, I also believe that too little focus is put on making the best platform for world-leading companies to grow. If we take, for instance, development of artificial intelligence in the future healthcare sector as an example, also discussed here today, I'm a bit afraid that we will regulate and legislate this in a way that probably prevents many of the solutions and innovations that would radically help people to ever see daylight. So we definitely need new foresight methods such as stress testing to create better laws, but we also need decision makers with a tasked responsibility to challenge the obvious, to think in the long term, to look beyond the immediate threats and opportunities and more in the emerging ones. The strength of an institutionalized actor, such as the Committee for the Future in Finland, is to do just this. So with this in mind, dear friends, I leave you with a question. Could the EU Parliament establish its own Committee for the Future, a political body tasked with advocating the long-term perspective in the EU matters? I definitely believe it would strengthen Europe in many, many ways, and I think we all agree that the world of today would benefit from a much stronger European Union. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Strand. Very interesting, the empowering bottom-up approach and what you are doing in your committee. I have just one quick question to you. Do you have any particular recommendation for the European Parliament? You said that it could be very good to follow your examples, but the way in which you set up these committees, can you say a few words on this?
Yes, absolutely. I believe it should be set up also in the European Parliament, because if I look on our committee, we never fight, we never vote, we don't look right, not left, just straight ahead. And when these people come together from different parties, and in Europe it would be from different countries, they usually spread that message to also many other committees where these same parliamentarians are members. So I see many benefits, and this is one of them.
Thank you very much. Again, I would like to invite participants to raise questions in our dedicated function box. I know that there is a map who would like to raise some question is Mr. Domenech Ruiz de Veza. Is it with us?
Hello, can you hear me?
Hello, yes, please. Welcome to our meetings. And thank you very much for joining us. And please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Panella, and thank you very much to the presenters, well, both the experts, of course, Alexandra, Mina, and Tine, and to Brando and Joachim. By the way, I found quite fascinating the idea of establishing a foresight committee in the European Parliament. But knowing this house and how jealous committees are of their competences, that will probably become a huge turf war and battle among committees. I can imagine the ITRE committee not being particularly thrilled about such a perspective, but I think it's still a very interesting and thought-provoking idea. And then Brando, I think he said something very useful regarding the moment in which we have to conduct this stress testing. So in order to be more concrete, my question is for everyone, but maybe in particular for the experts. This means in practice, to be concrete, that we should be basically, we are in a way basically directing the memo towards the Commission. So should be the Commission. The Commission is the one, except in a few cases, is the one that tables the first legislative proposal. So are we saying that this stress testing has to be conducted by the Commission? So what role for Parliament are we envisaging here? Then more generally, and maybe this is my lack of knowledge of the concept of a stress testing itself. For me, it's something that comes basically from the financial crisis. No, this is a word at the time connected to the stress tests of banks. But is this different? I think so. But can this be made clear? Because sometimes we have the risk of falling into fads, and there has been the fad of impact studies, no? So is this just another fad? I don't think so, no? But because, you know, when I went to the council to explain my project on electoral law, and a non-friendly government wanted to intervene, but didn't want to say anything regarding, you know, on real content. What did they say? Have you done an impact study? No, so it's like a very convenient, you know, thing to ask if you don't have anything political to say. And then last comment, also connected with this example, you have talked a lot about, you know, technology, natural catastrophes, but you said in your presentation that you believe this applies across all type of policies and files. So again, maybe I'm a special case as rapporteur for the electoral law, in which exceptionally is the Parliament who has the initiative. Stress testing, what does it mean for a new electoral law in Europe, or is just an odd case in which it doesn't apply, or you believe really this is something that can also apply to this kind of files that don't have a sector focus? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ruiz de Veza. I would like to reply firstly from our side, saying that what we are presenting today is the first result of the first project, and as I said, it is our intention to continue to work on it, and we are launching another year of reflection, and also to see how, from our point of view, EPRS could provide an effective tool to be close to the work of the committees and the MAP, using this stress testing methodology that we are now developing. I would like to see if Brando and Benifei or Mr. Strand, they have something to say to reply to Mr. Ruiz de Veza. Please, Brando, the floor is yours.
I think it's quite clear what was said. I agree with we need to work on how to operationalize. I can add that it's especially true, I think, with the AI Act, that we can use these for its specific nature to work as a context where to experiment how we can do this stress testing. It will be particularly important because of the need to have, if I can say, to avoid the situation that we had with the other digital norms at European level, that were just in the difficulty to be flexible enough and adaptable in time, with great change happening in short whiles. So we will need to find the right solutions, and it's clear that finding the right balance between regulation and innovation remains the biggest challenge. For example, I think it's important, that's something you propose, to provide specific obligations for critical infrastructure, also looking at the AI Act and the NIS2. This is certainly a good idea. And clearly, cybersecurity, it's we can say one field where we can see this kind of work to be particularly relevant, if we think of AI, but also on other topics. I wanted to add also this that I didn't say in the first intervention. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Benifei. I know that you have to leave soon, so allow me to thank you again for your participation. I would like simply to ask if Mr. Strand has something to add on this point.
Thank you. I agree with them both, and maybe just to save time, one thing I would like to stress is to have an even more closer relationship with the public and private sector when it comes to innovation and regulation, because although there is lots of critical infrastructure, there's also a lot of public infrastructure that can be made to living laboratories. For big companies, for startups, for universities, if we build a ferry between Finland and Sweden in my region, we don't see it as a ferry, as a link. It's a floating laboratory for world-leading climate technology. So that's one thing. Closer public-private cooperation would help the stress tests also. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I would like now to ask Tine if she has something to add on this point. And we have received a question from JRC, from Eckhart, that is addressed to Tine and us. And the question is, why is stress testing only applied with wildcards as a stressor? JRC sees a value in future-proof them with plausible long-term context scenario, plausible and constituent future that help to understand possible development of the policy problem as a basis for testing policy options. This is the question received by Eckhart from JRC that is with us. Please, Tine, the floor is yours.
Yes, I saw the question in the Q&A, and I think the short answer is that the two approaches are by no means exclusive, and that we see great merit in the approach outlined by Eckhart. But we were asked specifically to stress test in this context against high impact, low probability events. So that is what we've done. And we found that there is a merit to this as well. So my opinion would be that the two approaches should be applied at the same time, really. I think the Finnish approach stresses more the long-term comprehensive scenarios, and that I think that's very valuable as well. But the stress test against HILPS is also valuable.
Thank you very much, Tine. I would like now to give the floor to Ricardo Borges de Castro, that is one of our panelists for the second session, but he raised his hands to ask a question to the panelists on the first session. Please, Ricardo.
Thank you, Laura. I mean, I don't want to abuse my condition as speaker to spend much time here, but I want to actually to ask a question to Joaquin about the Committee on the Future in Finland, because I mean, one of my proposals at the end, I had a set of concrete proposals, and one of them was precisely that the European Parliament should create a Committee on the Future, and I can then discuss this further and give more arguments why this should be done. And as you saw, there was immediate reaction that this could create a problem in terms of committees and everybody fighting about turfs and these sort of things. And then you said that no, actually we all look into the same direction. But the question is, okay, I mean, there are 10 different parties at the Finnish parliament. 5 of them are in the government, 5 of them are in opposition. But I mean, the question is, how do you actually handle the future? I understand that you might all share this, see that the challenges are shared. But then politically, I mean, you might have different, let's say, tools to address some of these challenges. So how do you actually, as chair of the committee, manage this process politically? Thank you.
Thank you. Excellent question. And I think one important thing is that when a new term starts, you have 4 years ahead. We start from a clean table. We have some things binding us, but we very much start from a clean table, so we can focus on areas that are interested for the particular members. Someone is interested in elderly care, someone in how to integrate culture with innovation policy. So all the members are very motivated, and we have our own budget to also order reports on different issues. And it's a committee where we really respect each other, and I think it has a positive effects also on the work in other committees. So I highly recommend you, and very happy to hear that you have been active in this issue.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Strand, and I hope we can have you on board also for the next process of our studies and reflection here in EPRS and in the European Parliament. Thank you very much. We are now moving to panel 2 with our first esteemed speaker, that is Dimitri Lorenzani. Dimitri Lorenzani is a member of cabinet of the European Commission Vice President Maroš Šefčovič, where he is responsible for EU interinstitutional relations, strategic foresight, and economic affairs. He previously worked at the Secretary General of the European Commission and in the Director General for Economic and Financial Affairs. Thank you, Dimitri, for accepting our invitation. We know that the European Commission is actively seeking to integrate strategic foresight into lawmaking. For example, the revised better regulation guidelines and toolbox include a dedicated tool on strategic foresight. My question to you is, how do you see our work on stress testing with respect to the new approach being taken by the European Commission? Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Lauro, for the kind invitation to the event, and also to all the speakers for the insightful interventions so far. I will use just these 5 minutes to share some ideas related to the content of the study and to your question from the perspective of the Commission. I'd like to start by saying that this debate is very timely because we are witnessing profound transformations, not only in the world around us, but also in the way in which public institutions conceive their decision-making, in the direction mostly of more innovative governance tools that can allow to be more resilient in the face of disruptive events of the next big crisis. Of course, the example I know best is that back in 2019, Commission President von der Leyen had the vision to create the first ever college member in charge of strategic foresight. As you said, Vice President Maroš Šefčovič. Now, beware, foresight is not new in the Commission as a tool, but as a goal. It was used, at least since Jacques Delors' Cellule de Prospective back in 1989, but Vice President's mission letter now stresses the ambition to really embed foresight into policymaking. And this is the essence of strategic foresight. So foresight that is operational, that is able to inform policymaking. This is done, for instance, by our annual communications, the strategic foresight reports, identifying key megatrends for Europe and their policy implications to future-proof priority setting in the institution, to inform the President's State of the Union address and Commission work programs. And let me give an example. The topics of the 2 past reports, resilience and open strategic autonomy, have clearly become 2 fils rouges of many EU policies that we see today, from Next Generation EU to the EU Chips Act. However, as you said, our strategic foresight journey is not over. Actually, it is very much ongoing. And there are various channels we are exploiting to try to embed better foresight into policymaking. And one of these channels, which is also under the Vice President's portfolio, is indeed better regulation. Our goal here, as stated in the communication that you mentioned, is to make foresight an integral part of lawmaking. And there are two main ways to do so. The first one is to ensure that impact assessments and major evaluations of legislation take into account relevant megatrends, such as those that we identify in our strategic foresight report, in our annual communications. The second one, which is indeed the one of Toolbox 20, relates to what you just mentioned and consists in using future long-term scenarios to stress test how policies perform in various situations and lead to a menu of alternative policy options. This is why it was very interesting for me to read the EPRS study and its key findings, because we are in a phase of piloting some of these foresight methodologies, like reference scenarios, in a better regulation context. In particular, our Joint Research Center has just developed 4 reference scenarios on the global standing of the EU in 2040, with the goal of using them to stress test EU policies, especially, and here I'm echoing Mr. Benifei, when new initiatives are proposed, so in the preparatory phase indeed. These scenarios are not public yet, but a small subset focused on Europe's open strategic autonomy was used for our 2021 communication, our 2021 strategic foresight report, so it's indeed public. We are now developing this project gradually, step by step, and we are currently running a pilot stress test of different policy options for an important upcoming Commission initiative, that is the one on standard essential patents, so patents that basically protect a technology that is essential to a standard, a very topical issue. It was discussed actually today in college, for instance, standardization. This is very concrete, very important, very strategic. As China did in October 2021, the EU is focusing on strong technical standardization strategy, on a more strategic approach to international standardization, which is also key to our values and our open strategic autonomy. This means that we need good future-proof policy options, for instance, to promote a sustainable ecosystem of participation of innovators in standardization, to ensure a smooth access of implementers to standardized technology. And this is where our pilot, our Toolbox 20, comes in. It will allow stress testing concrete policy options against plausible scenarios and uncertainties. And so, in a way, in this, strategic foresight acts also as a form of risk management vis-à-vis long-term shifts, for instance, in geopolitical order, in dominating technologies, in dominating values of society. My time is almost up, so I would stop here, but I hope to have clarified 3 key messages to reply to your question, and then I'm also happy to expand further. First, that today's debate is very topical and not abstract at all, because also the Commission is moving in the direction of more foresight and better regulation, including concrete piloting of stress testing methodologies in the preparatory phase of future legislation. Second, as we often say for other aspects of better regulation, like assessing the impact of proposed amendments, this is a joint effort, and the European Parliament might want to do its part. This might even open future avenues of interinstitutional cooperation, like the one on horizon scanning that Vice President Šefčovič launched last year within ESPAS. And third, very importantly, last but not least, that we have a lot of food for thought from the findings of this study on the how stress testing should be conducted. For instance, the study stresses the benefits of this light stress testing against a small selection of HILPs, of high impact, low probability events, while maybe the Commission is now currently piloting a middle way, trying to future-proof policies against a fuller set of reference scenarios. So what I want to say is that we have a lot to discuss, a lot to cooperate on, as I agree with you that the lack maybe of a shared understanding of an established methodology might be an obstacle to the uptake of this very important method, of this very important goal. Thank you, Laura.
Thank you, Dimitri. This is very interesting because this is timely in line with what we are doing here in EPRS. So you are starting this pilot project, and we are starting the second phase of our pilot project. So do you see any possibility to integrate our work or the opportunity to further exchange? Because we have a daily exchange with colleagues in JRC, so this could be an opportunity to further work together on this interesting point. And my last question to you is regarding what Brando Benifei said relating to delegated act and flexibility. So at the end, how do you see this? How the Commission is considering this point, if the Commission is considering this point?
Thanks, Laura. No, I mean, absolutely. In terms of interinstitutional cooperation, as I mentioned, I think it's a very good idea that we develop this further, and I think the Joint Research Center can act as an important liaison. I also mentioned this other important project that the Vice President has launched to show, I mean, also our commitment to involve as much as possible the other institutions, because each institution has a lot of intelligence, I believe, to bring to the table. So, for instance, we have this project that I think actually is a very ambitious one, to create a sort of interinstitutional intelligence that will help our decision makers and policy makers across all EU institutions be able to better foresee, be better prepared for the next big crisis. And this is what actually JRC is piloting together with the horizon scanners, I would say, from all the EU institutions. Now, on the way in which to do this best, like what you mentioned about Brando, I mean, it's true that at the moment we are piloting this idea mostly in the context of basically impact assessment. So we are trying to consider stress testing mostly in the context where these methodologies can help us identify the best policy options. So they act as a sort of reinforcement of risk management in the phase of defining the policy problem, of defining how to solve it, of defining the policy options, and possibly also the treatment of risk. So what policy option works best? Obviously, there are various ways to do so, and flexibility, so it was mentioned. I mean, I think it's a very topical issue talking about delegated acts today, but it's certainly something that we should reflect on together.
Thank you very much, Dimitri. Now I would like to move to our second speaker, Béatrice Tolègne. Merci pour avoir accepté notre invitation, Madame. Béatrice Tolègne is a Director for Legislative Work at the European Committee of Regions. She has previously held a variety of positions as a policy advisor and manager in EU institutions and in France. She has been responsible for foresight at the Committee of Regions and has contributed to the work of the European Convention and the current conference on the future of Europe. Mrs. Tolègne, thank you for having joined us, and it's very interesting to see the point of view of the Committee of Regions and the point of view of applying this stress testing at regional or national level. Thank you very much, and please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Lauro, and thank you, Anthony and the EPRS for the opportunity to bring the local regional perspective to the discussion, and also congratulations to the authors of the study that serves our common objective to reinforce the relevance, resilience, and robustness of EU legislations and policies. I would like also to welcome the perfect momentum, as the purpose of this study is fully connected to the democratic, political, and also institutional dimension of EU good governance. Democratic as a conference of the future of Europe gives voice to citizens to address the global challenges EU faces today and to project into the future in order to shape a Europe fit for the next decades. Political strategic foresight is particularly essential for policymakers and not only for experts, and I would say especially at local and regional level. At the front line of crisis management, cities and regions are indeed at the core of the transformative agenda of the EU and fully fledged actors of change. Finally, institutional, in the context of the new dynamic of putting foresight at the heart of EU policy making, which was perfectly mentioned, explained by Dimitri in the previous intervention. And in this context, the Committee of the Regions worked alongside the other institutions to develop an efficient EU anticipatory governance. Our committee is indeed fully committed in the EU strategic foresight agenda, and the Vice President Šefčovič discuss with our President, our members regularly on that perspective. And TOR is also a member of the ESPAS community. Moreover, its foresight activities are becoming a strategic and driving force of its political priorities. According to the objective of the discussion today, I'm going to address briefly three strands. The first strand is the relevance and potential of strategic foresight in better lawmaking at local and regional level, and the fact also that stress testing is one of a complementary component of a comprehensive approach. I would like to highlight three key observations. The first observation is that stress testing cumulates two key objectives from the local and regional perspective. The objective of future-proofing, but also the objective of evidence-based policies. The second observation is that a stress testing process has strong similarities with territorial impact assessment approach and methodologies, notably as regards three variables. First, the degree of exposure to the effect of a particular situation. Second, the vulnerabilities of a particular area. And third, the adaptability of this area and these people. I have also noticed, it's my third observation, that stress testing borrows the methodological approach and some characteristic of territorial foresight, in particular vis-à-vis the inclusive and participatory approach. This complex of findings confirm that the question of governance is pivotal and that the stress testing exercises are based on an empirical work. But of course, the implementation of such methods is a long-term learning process. And for these reasons, my second strand is about the lessons learned and the challenges from existing experience of forms of stress tests at local and regional level. These studies mention an example in Netherlands involving local, regional, and national authorities to mitigate climate-related risk. This example is pertinent for two main reasons. First, climate risks are highly context-dependent. Second, multi-level governance is the appropriate way of addressing global challenges, as local and regional authorities are ideally placed to note the emerging challenges and assess their potential impact. Therefore, climate risk in one hand and the rise of inequalities in another hand between places and people are and should be one of the key priorities for shaping future-proof policies. It is one of the major assumptions of a recent European Central Bank stress test on climate risk. In the same vein, a stress test conducted by C40, a global network of mayors engaged in achieving the net zero in cities, apply a similar logic in three steps: identification of major risk, proposition to minimize this risk, and the selection of adaptation measures. We learn from this step that this logic covers also the entire policy cycle. We have also experimented in the European Committee of the Regions the value added to involve our politicians in such process. We have indeed initiated with a GRC a first ever strategic exercise for CER members and Covenant of Mayors ambassadors on two contrasting future scenarios on greening cities over a 20-year time horizon, leading to new perspective in transforming to greener and climate neutral cities. Their evaluation were always based on the analysis of risk for the cities and also from the citizens. The notions of risk in a short-term results, but long-term perspective are indeed the value added of this kind of bottom-up approach for the concept of urban resilience. We have learned also a lot from our experience and restitution process from our COVID stress tests for the cities and regions, leads to a very clear, political statement and a full support to the proposals of the European Commission to organize and in a coordinated manner the EU capacity stress tests on the health system, with of course an emphasis on the cross-border health threats and the full involvement of local and regional authority. In a nutshell, our experience of form of stress testing are promising, but key challenges remain. It is, from our perspective, fundamental to start from clear objective stress scenario and also not to put extra burden on new legislation without territorial impact assessment. Finally, the lack of data at local and regional level is still an obstacle, even if stress testing is a simulation exercise. Nevertheless, and it will be my third strength, investing in strategic foresight is not an option for us, it's an obligation. And I would like to reiterate today that contributing to the current better regulation agenda is a growing ambition for local and regional authorities. For these reasons, we explore and conducted several activities to apply long-term thinking to our policies process, such as developing our better regulation toolbox, and I would like here to emphasize our territorial assessment strategy, and also our contribution to the Fit for Future platform. We intend also to map the structural risk facing the EU and their implication for local and regional authorities. In that respect, we contribute to the initial mapping conducted by EPRS during the coronavirus crisis, and we gave a territorial perspective, and we also contribute to the new resilience dashboard launched by the European Commission. We intend also to devote more efforts in rural proofing as a tool for territorial impact assessment, focused on rural areas in the context of the EU long-term visions. We could also explore the value added of experimentation and testing regulatory sandbox at local level. Climate and energy are, from our perspective, relevant topics in that respect. But of course, in our collective effort, it's also our ambition in the CUR to reinforce the capacities, foresight capacities of local and regional authority, and to collect best practice from the ground with the perspective to enrich our legislative and consultative contribution to the EU decision-making process, but also with the perspective to establish a network of Ministers of the Future similar to the Minister of the Future. The wide spectrum of activities from analysis of trends and weak signals at local and regional level to ex-ante and ex-post evaluation of the EU legislation is, from our perspective, in line with one of the key findings of the study, considering that stress testing is not a sole solution to future-proof policy, but a part of a comprehensive framework. And to conclude, it's also obvious that cooperation between EU institutions and stakeholders are crucial to provide a new mindset to face the turbulent and disruptive developments and to mitigate the major risk. In 2 weeks, the Committee of the Regions and EPRS management will meet in a virtual retreat. Strategic foresight is one of the building blocks of our discussion, and I'm confident that we will address the question of future-proof policies when considering new avenues for cooperation and pertinent strategy. And our conversation today is, from my perspective, a perfect basis to move forward in that direction. Thank you, Laura.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Tolling. It's clear that there is an angle on focusing on regional needs here, because everybody remembers what happened a couple of years ago with the big floods in parts of Belgium, Germany, and other regions. So there is a need at the local level to take this into account, on board. What we would like to ask you, if it's possible, when you are aware of other experience in other regions that could be useful for our studies and analysis, because this is an ongoing process. This is a starting point of our reflection to identify the correct tool and way of operating across the legislative process to introduce this stress testing methodology. I would like to ask you if you are aware of other examples apart what Tina mentioned regarding the Netherlands in other regions in Europe, or municipalities. Please tell us if you are aware of other examples that you can tell us.
I mentioned in my statement, of course, all the networks we are working together regarding the objective of climate adaptation and mitigation, because I think this is a crucial for local and regional authorities. So of course we have the Netherlands, but we know that all these C40 are embracing a lot of regions and cities. We know that, for example, there is a stress test organized in the region of Valencia in Spain. We know that also there is a lot of example of this sorry, of this of these practices outside EU, for example, in UK. So this is a collection that we can also put forward to the collective effort when we collect best practice on foresight, a strategic foresight agenda. Sorry, but just and to reply to the second question, I agree with all the speakers. We have to to anticipate as much as possible. So the early stage of the legislation is, of course, the best place to be efficient regarding stress testing added value.
Thank you very much. Now we move to the third speakers, Mr. Borges de Castro. Ricardo, let me present you. He is Associate Director and Head of the Europe in the World Program at the European Policy Center, a Brussels-based think tank, and an Associated Fellow at the Geneva Center for Security Policy. He served as advisor for Foreign Affairs and Strategic Foresight in the European Political Strategy Center, and before that, he was a member of the cabinet of the President of the European Commission, Manuel Barroso. Ricardo, it's our great pleasure to have you here today, and you are the last one, so maybe you can also help us in summarizing what has been already said, but please, the floor is yours and we would like to know your views.
Thank you, Lauro, and also thank you to the EPRS for the very kind invitation to join this really what has been a fascinating discussion so far. If you allow me, I would like to sort of make 3 points. One, in trying to put this study in a broader context, because I believe that narrative and conceptualization is also relevant even for political actors when you need to go out and think and talk a little bit about these things. The second one is on the contribution that this study makes for what I call, or I like to call, anticipatory democracy. And then finally, how to actually make foresight, we haven't discussed this yet, actually make sure that foresight also stands the test of time. So stress testing foresight itself, how can we actually make sure at EU level that foresight is here to stay? So, I mean, on the first more conceptual note, in my view, and this, I mean, I think this study is very illustrative of that, stress testing policies is sort of stress testing the future. And the way that I look at this is that for me, the future is like a global common good. I mean, we tend to talk about space, the high seas, the Arctic, the atmosphere. But if we actually look at it, the future in a sense, and when we make policy, we are actually trying to determine, the future to a certain extent, but we are also determining future generations. We are also determining even, the life of the unborn. So if we actually look at the future as a global common good that belongs to everybody, even to those that are not here yet, this study makes a lot of sense, or this tool, this new tool makes a lot of sense. And so I think that starting to treat the future as actually that is something, sometimes it's far away, it might be exoteric, but it's actually palpable. I think we should be able to make that sort of more conceptual approach. So this would be my first remark from an analytical standpoint. From the contribution of this study, I think this study is a contribution. I mean, there are several different tools, and what I liked about this study, and what I start to see in many other fields, is really this bringing foresight methodologies together with other types of practices. And I think stress testing policies or stress testing legislation, to a certain extent, does this. And in my view, it contributes to reinforce this concept of anticipatory democracy. I mean, this idea is basically that we try to make sure that democracy stays as it is, you know, with electoral cycles, with diverse political viewpoints, but at the same time, we think long term. We are able to actually prepare the future. And so and which sometimes it's not completely obvious that these two are reconcilable, because as we know, I mean, in Europe, when we look at a political landscape in Europe, in some places it's becoming more fragmented, more polarized. So I think it's also becoming more challenging. And I think, I mean, in the European Parliament, I think this picture is relatively the same, to find consensus and to find ways to actually address a problem in the long term. So I think this study, as a tool that you can concretely use, can contribute to that, sort of strengthening of democracy. And in my view, and here, I mean, I agree with all that I've said, that this should be at the preparatory phases of legislation, but I believe that this should be an ongoing process. It shouldn't be just happen there. It should be an iterative process that has feedback loops that you can actually continuously evaluate. And I say this because, I mean, the study focuses mostly on what we would call in the foresight field as black swans. You know, this sort of rare events, but that have a very high impact. We also know that there are events that are ongoing. And I would say that the speed of change nowadays, for example, has an impact, for example, on artificial intelligence legislation, for sure. You know, the debate that we are having today, and when this legislation is out, it will be already different. AI will have evolved. And so I think this needs to be a continuous process that accompanies the changes that are ongoing. I mean, we could have this discussion about the GDPR. It has already changed. I mean, let's say that the world that the GDPR was trying to regulate has changed in the meantime. And I think that this idea of pace of change has also to do with democracies, because democracies, tend to be, when you compare it to other actors that do not follow our rule book, they can be much faster. They can make a decision, they decide, they implement. We need political deliberation. We want to have diverse views. We want to have everybody on board. We want to have our citizens participating in these discussions. And so if democracy cannot be faster, it needs to be smarter. In a sense, that needs to be able to anticipate things that policies or legislation that we're trying to do. So again, I think stress testing policies is a good way also to do this in very concrete terms, and can be done by different actors. Now, making sure that foresight and all these efforts that we are doing, and that in the Commission, Vice President Šefčovič, but also ESPAS and others in the whole networks in the committees have been doing. How do we make this system sustainable? I mean, foresight, as Dimitri was saying, is not new in the Commission. But it also has had highs and lows, and we are on a current high. How do we make sure that the current high is sustainable? And I think here is where I would probably, would attempt some recommendations. I mean, I think a key point that links both anticipatory democracy and the maintenance or the persistence of foresight practices is that we need to have a strong public administration, and we need to have strong parliaments, and we need to have strong think tanks, independent thinking, evidence-based analysis that allow us actually to make decisions, based on facts and evidence, not on things that are really not part of this conversation. And I think this is really, crucial in our democracies. But then making sure that this would maintain, or would make persistence. First, was the idea that we already discussed, creating a European Parliament committee on the future. And I say this why? Because this would create immediately the demand for more foresight. This would create the demand across the institution for more foresight, for more accountability, for more transparency. And so I think, if the parliamentarians think that this is going to be a problem, think differently about this. Think differently about this issue, and I'm happy to continue discussing this with them if necessary. How can we actually make this happen? Second element, which is an innovation that Vice President Šefčovič has already created, which is this network of ministers for the future. They do need to be ministers for the future. Now they are they are indicated by their governments, but these are ministers from different portfolios and different areas. Some of them, or the majority of them, governments. It has in the past. Sweden has had a minister for the future. Other, Finland has a committee on the future in the parliament. you could have, I mean, if you don't have a minister, at least have a junior minister or deputy minister to the prime minister that is responsible for this function. Really, to have a broad view. Foresight is multidisciplinary. It doesn't look in silos, it looks across silos. So I think this element is important. So really have ministers for the future at the member state level. And then I think, of course, you know, we need to continue the efforts that the Commission is doing in terms of building capabilities of foresight within the Commission, but also beyond the Commission. And when we go beyond I think the element that, and these are two final thoughts. First, and this is an idea that I'm sure that Anthony and many others in the ASPES community are familiar, which is, why don't we create ASPESes for different policy areas? Why don't we put, you know, individuals, policymakers, so even politicians, if necessary, from the different institutions, from the different committees that work on AI, discussing AI informally. You know, I think these, like ASPES discusses the future, I think, or global trends, this could happen. And finally, I think as a giveaway to make sure that this really does continue to stay, is that the Commission, and at the end of this term, creates this what would be a strategic foresight support service. I mean, no country or a majority of countries in Europe are not, you know, are not as advanced as Finland is. We know that foresight, stress testing, all of these activities are extremely time and resource consuming. So the Commission, the same way that the European Commission had a few years back, and now it's a DG, this, you know, the Structural Reform Support Service, it could have a strategic foresight support service that could send teams to the member states that could help create foresight units in these member states, and sort of have an interchange of discussion. And when we do a global trends report in Europe or in one of the member states, if it's about Europe, it should cover all European countries. So we don't need to have 27 different global trend studies. So let's try also here not to duplicate and to try to find synergies. And so I would say that if we take some of these measures in going forward, we also have a better chance of making sure that foresight survives beyond the champions. We are all foresight champions here, but you know, we will move to other activities, we will do other things. It is important that when we go, when people move on from their current responsibilities, foresight, anticipation, and, you know, anticipatory democracy stays with us. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Borges de Castro. Very interesting reflection. The debate is now launching and there are reflections coming, but the timing is running out. I would like simply to summarize everything in one simple question to our three speakers. And the question is, to what extent the stress testing could be an instrument to transfer the results of the foresight activity in the concreteness of the legislation? Please, Dimitri, then Madame Pauline, and then Ricardo.
Absolutely. Foresight allows us to reflect on these long-term trends, but also on these risks, on what is the next crisis, and make our legislation and our decision-making more future-proof. So I actually absolutely agree with your perspective, and also with what Ricardo was saying. I think actually better regulation is one of the channels we are using to do this, but it's not the only one. I think Ricardo also mentioned the other important one that I always mention in when I discuss about this issue. It is the coordination structures. So we need to be ambassadors of foresight, I would say, more than champions, every day, to pass the message and to make sure that foresight capabilities are developed in the member states. It's not just about European institutions. I mean, when we talk about legislation, I think it's exactly the same discussion we have about burden reduction, the burden reduction part of better regulation. It's not just about those who propose legislation, the European Commission, or those who amend legislation, European Parliament and the Council, but also about those who transpose legislation, for instance, the member states. So I think this is very important. And of course, as we launched last year in Coimbra, the network of the 27 ministers for the future, I think that this is an important starting point. I think more can indeed be done. So we'll try directly to involve more these ministers for the future, to make them part of this discussion, and also to pass to them, let's say, a little bit this debate about the legislative way, the legislative channel to embed foresight. I like a lot, actually, the idea of Ricardo of an FSS, a Strategic Foresight Support Service. This is quite interesting, and also about the fact that we need some coordination, so that we don't need to duplicate, but we need this overarching perspective. We try to do our part, but of course, if we do this with the European Parliament, of course, we are much stronger. If you allow me, Laura, there is also a question by Eckhard in the chat, so I think maybe I will also take a little bit this one. I think it's an important point. I mean, when we talk about these scenarios, you have to distinguish about broader reference scenarios and only wildcards or black swans. The pilot we are trying to develop also thinks and reflects on how we could link these two aspects. So how these reference scenarios could be stress tested in the context of, for instance, major disasters or these HILP events with what if questions. So what if a major cyber attack happens in a certain scenario? But we have also to discuss about what is the best approach here. Thank you.
Ms. Tolin, please.
Thank you, Laura. I will be very short. We can benefit from stress testing in the global approach of foresight, strategic foresight, for me in two dimensions. First is raising awareness, and it's linked to what was said earlier by Ricardo. Awareness of citizens, awareness also of politicians regarding how we have to face the future challenges and to anticipate. So anticipatory democracy means raising awareness, and I think this kind of exercise is really crucial to raise awareness. The second point is about, it's what mentioned earlier about the coordination and the multi-level approach from bottom up to European and also horizontal. So multi-level, it's horizontal and it's vertical. So I think that if we can encompass these two dimensions, we will maybe succeed to give a strong scheme and framework for anticipatory governance.
Thank you very much, Mr. Lane. And Ricardo, please.
I'll be very brief. I think what stress testing, what this study and the results of the study, I think what they allow us is to do foresight in action, is actually to put foresight into concrete issues. And probably a way to mainstream this across institutions is to make a game, is to make cards of these HILPs, as they called, and that anyone that is sitting in their own desk thinking about a policy or a certain DG is thinking about a new initiative, that they actually, when they start conceptualizing, will look at these cards, will play with these cards, you know, how will our ideas be impacted by this? So this would be a concrete way to actually make use of this. And I'm sure the JRC would also be able to do this. They have others in games for policymakers. So I think this would not be new. And it's actually also an innovative way of making policy making, because I think in our lives, we also need to have fun when we are doing these things. I mean, besides thinking about very serious issues, this can also elicit imagination. It's very important, and I'll finish here, that as these processes become more mainstreamed, that they don't become bureaucratized. There's a level of creativity and imagination that is very important in foresight, and we can't lose that just to have a process or to tick a box. We have done, you know, the stress test. Let's move on. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Very interesting, this last remark about risk of bureaucratization. Before moving to the conclusion, I would like to simply ask our speaker, Mr. Strand, if he would like to say something before our conclusion. Please.
Problems with my camera. I thank you very much for this excellent discussion, and if we can do anything from the Finnish side to help you organize a committee for the future in the Parliament, we will give you all support and look forward to continue the discussion.
Thank you very much. And now let's conclude, and I would like to give the floor to Wolfgang Hiller. He is our director here for impact assessment and European added value in the European Parliament Research Services. He held various positions within the European Parliament and European Commission, including head of the Parliament's office in Vienna and head of the Secretariat for the European Parliament Conference of Presidents. Wolfgang, the floor is yours to conclude, and Anthony at the end, if he would like to say some final words. Please.
Thank you, Lauro. We are indeed approaching the end of this very fascinating policy workshop. It's now my role to thank all the speakers and participants once more for their interesting input. It was very good to hear from you, you who are representing a wide range of perspectives encompassing local and regional level, the member state level, and of course, the European Union itself. I've noted a number of concrete suggestions and views, and we will take them very serious indeed. This event is neither the start nor the end of our work on stress testing. We are rather in the middle of the process to establish stress testing in the European Parliament. And this means that we continue to be grateful for any comments and feedbacks which you may have also in the future after today's event. I think we all agree that in times of uncertainty, stress testing is a valuable addition to the toolbox of responsible policy making. And while some of us might have thought so already before today, I think this event made us even more convinced of this value. There exists potential value of stress testing to better lawmaking in very many ways, similar to, but not exactly in the same way as foresight, which deserve both to be integrated increasingly into the legislative process in the European Parliament and more widely. To support this, we in EPRS have invested in extending our knowledge and capabilities in this regard, and we will continue to do so. It's time, however, to stop just talking about it. We now need to act and to apply stress testing within the Parliament and more broadly. This is why we will now move to the next phase. While the project will continue as a project as such for the rest of the whole legislature, we will now roll out stress testing very concretely as an offer to the whole of Parliament and its members. For this, we will enter into intensive dialogue with committees and other parliamentary actors to find the best way when and how to include stress testing more regularly in parliamentary work throughout the policy cycle. I have noted that one of the options, of course, is to do this in the preparatory phase, ex ante, to check all or parts of a legislative proposal in the pipeline or presented. There's also the possibility to do ex-post stress testing of existing policies, similar to ex-post evaluation work. And one could use stress testing in cases where there is no expectation that new or amending legislation would be forthcoming immediately for various reasons, but where more information about weak points of existing policies or legislation in case of disruption may still be useful to have and may lead to actions by others than legislators. And fourth possibility is that we in the Parliament, we may be tempted to look very concretely at legislation the Parliament is proposing itself or has proposed, but the Commission has not yet reacted upon by proposing a concrete legislative file, to see what costs and risks arise due to the absence of such legislation. What I found very encouraging in this regard is that the methodology developed allows upscaling and downscaling, which enables stress testing to be used in many circumstances, even by using a light approach. And this is particularly important in the parliamentary dimension, as time is key and we cannot spend, I would say, months or more on a specific file. It needs to be fast. There's nobody who wants to wait for years. And so it needs to be included in the time frame which we have. And the methodology seems to allow this. Stress testing, European added value work and foresight are closely interlinked. In the European Parliament, we have always embraced such new concepts and tools. This was the case with European added value, with foresight, and now again, it's the case with stress testing. We hope that stress testing will not be limited to the European Parliament. We encourage the European Commission and other institutions to include it proactively in their work as well. And we have heard our colleague from the Cabinet of the Vice President speaking about the Commission's intentions and work in this regard. We are ready to work together and share knowledge, as we do in many other instances, in the usual spirit of cooperation, as we all agree and are convinced that better regulation, better lawmaking is a joint responsibility. Which brings me to the end of my conclusions and to the end of this roundtable. From my side, I would like to thank you again for all contributions and wish you a nice day. Maybe Anthony, I'm not, if you want to say a few more words of conclusion, over to you.
Thank you very much, Wolfgang, for those concluding remarks, and thank you also to Lauro for so expertly moderating the very rich and thoughtful and thought-provoking discussion which we've had over these last couple of hours. I think it's been an EPRS policy roundtable at its very best. Thanks obviously to all of those who have been online throughout this period, and also a special thank you to our speakers. And we've had quite a number. Thank you to Alexandra, Mina and Tine for the initial presentations. Thank you to Brando and Joachim for the parliamentary perspectives which you very kindly brought to bear. And I'd like to especially thank Joachim Strand for the fact that he's been with us throughout and has, I think, on a very, very busy day in the Finnish Parliament, spared the time to really follow this discussion, contribute very significantly towards it. And thank you to our institutional and think tank partners who have given their own insights to this very rich, as I say, conversation about something which is at the cutting edge of EU policymaking and the EU policy cycle. So the kind of reflections that we've been engaged in have the potential to shape the future, not only because we're talking about the future, but we're talking about how we should try in the different EU institutions to master or at least influence the direction of travel in so many directions, in so many areas. And we really we're really taking this process, as I think you can see, seriously. We're doing it not only in respect of the classic policy cycle and respect, as Wolfgang mentioned, of work that we've been doing here in EPRS on impact assessment, European added value, ex post evaluation now for several years, but also we're building on an exercise which is occurring in parallel on risks, capabilities and resilience of the EU system. And I'd like to mention that we'll be producing a parallel volume, the one that we've been discussing today, called Future Shocks 2022, which is monitoring risks and building capabilities for Europe in an uncertain world. That'll be coming out in the next few weeks, and its attempt to draws together in the first of what will be an annual publication, the work that we are doing in how to make the EU system stronger and more resilient. And we're looking at 15 specific potential shocks that could be delivered to the system and how best to respond to them. And so this discussion today on stress testing forms part of, it's one piece, if you like, in a much broader range of initiatives, all of them designed to enhance the quality of policymaking in the European Union. Thank you so much for your contribution to this process. The next EPRS online policy roundtable will be next Tuesday lunchtime, and we'll be looking at an annual publication which EPRS brings out at the beginning of each year, Economic and Budgetary Outlook, most obviously, of course, in this case, towards 2022. This looks at the trajectory of the European economy over the last year and potentially the coming year. It looks at how the EU budget and the MFF and now NGEU fits into that. And it'll look in particular at some of the implications of NGEU for the macroeconomic role of the European Union. So hope to see as many of you as possible next Thursday lunchtime. And this lunchtime, say once again, thanks to everybody and have a very nice afternoon. Goodbye.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye, everyone.